you're thinking about someone. Not in that deliberate way where you decide to think about them. It's more subtle than that. A random thought, a fleeting memory. Maybe a song they loved pops into your head. Or you remember something they said to you years ago. Or maybe you just have this odd sense that you should text them. And then your phone buzzes. It's them. Your first instinct is to brush it off. Coincidence. Happens all the time. But then it happens again. And again. You think about calling your mom, and she's already trying to reach you. You stumble across the exact book you needed while browsing a library shelf you've never visited before. Once feels like chance. Twice might be luck. But when it happens repeatedly, something shifts. It stops feeling random. It starts feeling like something is happening. Like the universe is trying to tell you something. Like there's a hidden connection between your thoughts and reality. And somehow, mysteriously, they're synchronized. Carl Jung called this synchronicity. He was one of the greatest psychological minds of the 20th century, and near the end of his life, he became obsessed with this idea. Meaningful coincidence. A causal connection. The notion that some events aren't connected by cause and effect in the ordinary way we understand it, but rather by meaning, by significance, by something deeper that we don't have words for. And here's what's fascinating. Jung wasn't being poetic or mystical about this. He wasn't abandoning science. He was genuinely trying to explain something real that he kept observing. Something that didn't fit into the standard scientific framework, and yet seemed too consistent, too profound, to dismiss as mere chance. But then here's the thing that makes it disturbing. Modern psychology has a different name for this exact same phenomenon. Apophenia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data, to find connections that aren't really there, to convince yourself that chaos is actually order, that randomness is actually message. In other words, we're really good at fooling ourselves. So which is it? Is synchronicity real? A genuine connection between mind and reality that science hasn't figured out yet? Or is it an illusion? A beautiful trick our brains play on us, a glitch in our pattern recognition system that we've mistaken for cosmic meaning. And here's the part that really gets under your skin. What if both are true? Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Mind Lab. I'm glad you've found your way here. Maybe it's late where you are, or maybe you just like to fall asleep thinking about strange and beautiful ideas. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most mysterious feelings in the human mind, synchronicity. Those moments when coincidences feel too perfect to be random, as if reality itself is whispering back. Before we begin, I'm curious, what time is it where you're listening from? And have you ever had a coincidence that felt impossible to explain? Leave a comment. I read them all, and I love hearing your stories. If these calm explorations help you rest, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this little corner of curiosity keep growing. Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Because it does. Even if it's an illusion, even if our brains are playing tricks on us, the experience is undeniable. People feel it. They trust it. They build their lives around it. And that's where this whole mystery begins. So what is synchronicity really? Jung's definition is deceptively simple. It's the coming together of two events that are causally unrelated yet feel meaningfully connected. Not cause and effect, but meaning and meaning. Significance attracting significance. Here's how Jung described it. Imagine you're thinking intensely about an old friend. You haven't seen them in years. You haven't spoken to them, but they're on your mind. And then you run into them on the street, or they call, or a letter arrives from them the same day you were thinking about them. In the conventional view, this is just probability, randomness. You think about thousands of people over the course of a year, and statistically, sometimes those thoughts will coincidentally align with real events. The universe is huge, Coincidences happen. That's all this is. But Jung said, what if it's not? What if there's a principle at work that we don't yet understand? What if consciousness itself, your mind, your awareness, has some kind of influence on the world around you that isn't physical in the conventional sense? Not magic, not mysticism, but something real that exists outside our current scientific categories. And here's what made Jung take this seriously. It happened to him, repeatedly. There's a famous story. Jung was sitting across from a patient, a woman with significant psychological resistance. She was intellectualizing everything, blocking genuine emotional connection to her therapy. And Jung said to her, I think you should listen to your dreams. Pay attention to what your unconscious is trying to tell you. She was dismissive, skeptical. She left his office, and that same evening she had a vivid dream. In the dream, a scarab beetle, a golden scarab, came to her. She was amazed by the dream. The next morning, she came back to Jung's office to tell him about it. And as she was describing the dream, there was a scratching sound at the window behind Jung. They both looked. Outside the window, tapping against the glass, was a scarab beetle, an actual insect. In Switzerland, in the middle of the city, a scarab beetle doesn't belong there. It's not the right climate. They're rare. And yet here it was, arriving at the exact moment the patient was describing her dream about it. Jung opened the window. The beetle flew in. He caught it and showed it to her. Now, you could dismiss this as pure coincidence. Statistically possible. Unlikely, but possible. But Jung didn't dismiss it. He was struck by the meaningfulness of the timing, by the way the external event seemed to mirror the internal experience, by the synchronicity of it all. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Jung collected stories like this for decades. He observed them in his practice. His patients experienced them. He experienced them himself. And he became increasingly convinced that there was something here. Something real, something patterned, that materialist science couldn't explain. So he tried to create a theoretical framework for it. He called it the synchronicity principle. And he said it operates on what we might call meaningful causality. Not physical causality, not one thing pushing another thing, but causal connection through meaning, through significance, through the deep patterns that connect the inner world of consciousness to the outer world of events. Think about it this way. In our ordinary understanding, cause and effect work through physical mechanisms. You push a domino, it falls. You heat water, it boils. There's a material mechanism connecting cause to effect. But what if there's another principle entirely? What if things can be connected not through physical mechanism, but through shared meaning? This is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. We're trained to think causally, to trace mechanism, to reduce everything to physical interaction. But Jung was suggesting that meaning itself might be a principle of organization in the universe. That events can align, not because one physically caused the other, but because they resonate with each other on some deeper level. And here's what's so disturbing about this idea. If it's true, it means the universe is fundamentally different from what we've been taught. It means consciousness isn't just a byproduct of physical processes. It means the boundary between inner mind and outer world is more permeable than we realized. But before we go any further, we need to ask the harder question, the one that makes scientists uncomfortable. How do we know Jung wasn't just seeing patterns in randomness? How do we know he wasn't experiencing what modern psychology calls epiphania? Seeing meaningful connections that aren't really there. Because that's the thing about synchronicity. It's seductive. It makes sense. It feels true. And humans, we're incredibly good at finding patterns. Even when there are no patterns. Even when we're staring at pure randomness, our brains will construct meaning from it. So let's go there. Let's talk about how our brains work. Because understanding how we create meaning might be the key to understanding whether synchronicity is real or just the ultimate trick our minds play on us. The pattern-seeking brain. Your brain is not actually trying to understand reality accurately. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Your brain's job isn't truth, it's survival. And to survive, your brain needs to detect patterns quickly. It needs to notice when things are connected. It needs to see danger and opportunity and meaning in the chaos of sensory input that's constantly bombarding you. So it's built, quite literally, neurologically, to find patterns, even when they're not there. Consider this experiment. Scientists showed people random dots on a screen. Just dots, no pattern. But the vast majority of people saw patterns. They saw animals. They saw faces. They saw meaning. A different area of the brain activated, the pattern recognition center, and suddenly the randomness became coherent. This ability serves us well most of the time. A rustling in the grass might be the wind, or it might be a predator. Your ancestors who assumed it was a predator and ran away survived. Your ancestors who carefully analyzed whether it was probably just the wind got eaten. So your brain is wired to err on the side of pattern finding. It's conservative in a specific way. It sees danger and meaning even when it might not be there. But this has a cost. The same system that lets you recognize your mother's face in a crowd, that lets you notice when someone is acting strangely, that lets you sense when something is off. That same system is constantly lying to you. It's making connections that aren't really there. It's finding meaning in randomness. Scientists have a name for this. They call it apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. A related concept is pareidolia, which is when you see faces in clouds, or in the moon, or in the pattern of water stains on a wall. Your brain is pattern completing. It's taking incomplete information and filling in the blanks with patterns it's learned. This happens automatically, unconsciously. You can't stop it even when you know it's happening. There's a classic example. Look at this. ISTIS. Your brain doesn't actually see those individual letters. It sees the word IS, TIS. It pattern completes. Your brain has learned that certain letters often appear together, that certain combinations are meaningful, and so it fills in the gaps. Now imagine that same process happening at the level of meaning. Imagine you're thinking about someone, and then you see them a few days later. Your brain connects these two events. It detects the pattern, thought followed by appearance, and it assigns meaning to that connection. Not because the connection is physical or causal, but because your brain's pattern recognition system has detected a coincidence and turned it into significance. This is the core of the apophenia argument. It's why skeptics say synchronicity is an illusion. It's a beautiful, meaningful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. And they have a point. Our brains are absolutely capable of this. But here's where it gets interesting. There's something called the salience bias. When you learn a new word, say, you hear petrichor for the first time, suddenly you start seeing it everywhere. You hear it in conversations. You read it in articles. You see it on signs. Did petrichor suddenly become more common in the world? No, of course not. Your brain just started paying attention to it. It became salient. And because it became salient, you noticed it. This is related to synchronicity, but slightly different. With the salience bias, the thing was always there. You just started noticing it. With synchronicity, the claim is that there's an actual alignment of events, not just a change in your noticing. But here's what's crucial. Even if synchronicity is partially explained by our pattern recognition system, that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It just means we can't easily separate the real phenomenon from the psychological mechanism that detects it. Think about it this way. When you fall in love, neurochemicals flood your brain. Dopamine, oxytocin. your brain is in a distinctive state. Does that mean love isn't real? Does that mean the connection you feel to another person is just neurochemistry? Most of us would say no. The neurochemistry doesn't invalidate the experience. The neurochemistry is how the experience manifests in a biological brain. But the love itself, the connection, the meaning, is real. Could synchronicity work the same way? Could there be a real phenomenon, a real connection between events that manifests through our pattern recognition system? Could our brains be detecting something real, even if the mechanism by which we detect it is imperfect? This is where it gets philosophically interesting, because the question becomes, if your brain detects a pattern and that pattern matches an external event, how do you know the pattern isn't real? In other words, how do you distinguish between a true pattern in reality and a pattern your brain has constructed? This is actually an ancient question in philosophy. It's called the problem of induction. How do we know our perceptions match reality? How do we know we're not just pattern, completing our way through a universe that's actually random? And the answer might be unsettling. We don't. Not completely. Not with absolute certainty. But let's dig deeper. Let's look at what we actually know about how often coincidences happen. Because maybe the real question isn't whether our brains find patterns. It's whether coincidences are actually more common than we think. And if they are, then maybe what Jung saw wasn't apophenia at all. Maybe it was just probability being misunderstood. The math of coincidence. Here's a question that will blow your mind if you let it. How many people do you need in a room before there's a 50% chance that two of them share the same birthday? Most people guess high. 100, 200. The real answer is 23. Just 23 people. In a room of 23 random people, there's a slightly better than 50-50 chance that two of them have the same birthday. This is called the birthday paradox. And the reason it seems paradoxical is that our intuition about probability is deeply broken. We tend to dramatically underestimate how often unlikely things happen. This is one of the fundamental ways human intuition misleads us about the world, and it's crucial to understanding synchronicity. Here's why. Let's say you think about someone, and then they contact you within the same day. What's the probability of that happening by chance? Well, it depends. On any given day, how many people might you think about? How many people know your contact information? How many times do people you know actually reach out to you? Once you start calculating all the variables, the probability of at least one coincidence like this happening fairly regularly starts to look not that unlikely. Maybe not even that surprising. In fact, there's research on this. A psychologist named David Marks studied what he called the personal probability of coincidences. He analyzed how often people report meaningful coincidences, and he compared that to the mathematical probability of those events happening randomly. And here's what he found. The observed frequency of coincidences matched the predicted frequency almost perfectly. In other words, people reported exactly as many coincidences as you'd expect from pure probability. This suggests that synchronicity might just be coincidence, that we're pattern finding in randomness, that there's nothing actually special happening. It's just that the universe is so big and so full of potential connections that when random events occasionally align, we notice them and assign meaning. But wait, there's something else going on here that makes it more complicated. Because humans don't just notice coincidences randomly. We remember the hits and forget the misses. This is called the file drawer effect or confirmation bias. You think about someone and they call. You remember that. But how many times do you think about someone and they don't call? Those incidents vanish from your mind. They don't register. They don't create a memory worth keeping. So your internal experience is skewed. It feels like coincidences happen more often than they statistically do, because you're systematically forgetting all the times they don't happen. An analogy: imagine a person plays the lottery every week. Once every 5 years, they win $50. They celebrate. They tell everyone. It feels like they have a special relationship with luck. But if you looked at the actual odds, they're winning exactly at the expected rate. They just notice the wins and forget the losses. This is almost certainly part of what's going on with synchronicity. You think about people you know, hundreds of people, thousands of times throughout your life. Statistically, some of those thoughts will randomly align with actual contact from those people. And you'll remember those alignments vividly. You'll forget all the times you thought about someone and they didn't contact you. So from a purely mathematical standpoint, synchronicity might be explainable as probability plus selective memory plus our tendency to find patterns in noise. And if that's the case, then Jung was just experiencing what any human brain experiences: the inevitable coincidences that arise from a large number of random events. He was intelligent enough to recognize patterns, but not skeptical enough to account for the file drawer effect. He noticed the hits and invented a metaphysical principle to explain them. It's a compelling argument, and it's probably true as far as it goes. But here's where the argument breaks down. Because even if most coincidences are explainable as probability plus selective memory, that doesn't mean all of them are. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as a genuine synchronicity. It just means that synchronicity, if it exists, would be rare, exceptional, hard to distinguish from normal coincidence. And that raises an interesting question. How would you even know if synchronicity was real? How would you prove it? Jung and the quantum physicists. Carl Jung didn't come to his ideas about synchronicity in isolation. In fact, he corresponded with one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli was a close friend and colleague, and the two men spent years in deep conversation about the nature of reality, the nature of mind, and whether there might be some fundamental connection between them that modern science was missing. Pauli was fascinated by something that had emerged from quantum mechanics. And this is where the story takes a very strange turn. In the 1920s and 1930s, quantum physicists discovered something that seemed to violate every principle of classical physics. At the quantum scale, at the level of atoms and subatomic particles, reality doesn't work the way we thought it did. Particles don't have definite positions until they're measured. Observation affects outcome, and particles that are entangled seem to instantly affect each other across vast distances in ways that shouldn't be possible according to Einstein's theory of relativity. This bothered Einstein. It bothered a lot of physicists, because it seemed to suggest that the universe was fundamentally non-local. That separation was an illusion. That consciousness or observation played a role in determining what was real. Jung found this fascinating, because it seemed to provide a potential opening, a crack in the materialist edifice, through which something like synchronicity might operate. Here's the core idea. If quantum mechanics shows that particles are somehow connected across space and time, if observation can influence reality, if the universe is fundamentally non-local in ways we don't fully understand, then maybe consciousness isn't as isolated and powerless as we've been taught. Maybe mind and matter aren't completely separate. Maybe there's a deeper level of reality where they're connected. And if that's true, then synchronicity might be one way that connection manifests. Now, I need to be clear here. Most physicists would say that Jung was overinterpreting quantum mechanics. They'd say that quantum entanglement is a specific phenomenon at the quantum scale and doesn't directly translate to macroscopic events like coincidences in your everyday life. They'd say that using quantum mechanics to explain synchronicity is a category error, like using chemistry to explain your emotions. And they might be right. In fact, they probably are right about the technical physics. But here's what's interesting. Jung and Pauli were thinking about something deeper. They were asking, what if the same principles that operate at the quantum level, the non-locality, the connection between observer and observed, the role of meaning in determining outcome, what if those principles also operate at larger scales? What if they're fundamental to reality itself? This is speculative. It's not standard physics. But it's not nonsense. It's philosophy of physics. It's metaphysics. And it's an attempt to grapple with genuine mysteries that physics hasn't fully resolved. Here's one of those mysteries, the observer effect. In quantum mechanics, when you measure a particle, the act of measurement affects the outcome. Before measurement, a particle exists in what's called a superposition. It doesn't have a definite state. But when you observe it, when you measure it, the superposition collapses and the particle takes on a definite state. Now, the question that has bothered physicists for a century is, what counts as an observer? Does consciousness play a role? Or is it just that any interaction, any physical interaction with the system, counts as observation? Most physicists say the latter. They say consciousness doesn't matter. Any physical measurement counts as observation. But some physicists, particularly the ones influenced by quantum interpretations like the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, have suggested that consciousness might play a fundamental role, that the universe isn't fully real until it's observed, that mind and matter are fundamentally connected. This is considered fringe physics by most standards, but it's not insane. It's a legitimate interpretive possibility. And it opens a conceptual door through which synchronicity might walk. Here's how Jung might have framed it. If consciousness can affect quantum systems through observation, then maybe consciousness can affect macroscopic events through meaning. Maybe the universe is structured such that when you invest meaning in something, when your attention focuses on something, it becomes more likely to manifest in the external world. Is this true? Probably not. Most evidence suggests no. But is it metaphysically possible? Is it consistent with what we know about quantum mechanics? Yes, arguably it is. And that's what made Jung's thinking so compelling to people. Not that it's definitely true, but that it's possible. That the universe might be ordered according to principles more subtle and interconnected than our materialist worldview allows. Of course, the challenge is that synchronicity, under this interpretation, would be incredibly rare and subtle. It wouldn't be the kind of thing you could point to and say, there it is. It would be more like a gentle tendency, a slight bias in probability toward meaningful alignment, the kind of thing that would be almost impossible to measure or prove. Which brings us to the next question. If synchronicity is so subtle and hard to prove, why do so many people feel so certain they're experiencing it? Why synchronicity feels true? There's something almost magical about the moment when a coincidence happens. Time seems to slow down. Your perception sharpens. You feel a sense of wonder, sometimes awe. There's a rightness to it, a sense that this was meant to happen. For a moment, the world seems to reveal an order underneath the chaos, a hidden logic, a responsive universe. This experience, this felt sense of meaning and connection, is incredibly powerful, and it's completely independent of whether synchronicity is actually real. In other words, people can feel absolutely convinced of synchronicity, not because synchronicity is objectively happening, but because the experience of meaningful coincidence produces a specific phenomenological state, a way of perceiving that feels deeply true. And here's the thing, from the inside, from the perspective of the person experiencing it, that felt truth is their reality. It shapes how they understand the world. It shapes their decisions. It shapes their life. This gets at something fundamental about human consciousness. We don't experience reality objectively. We experience it through the filter of meaning. And meaning is produced not just by external events, but by internal states, by emotion, attention, memory, and the narratives we construct. So when a synchronicity happens, several things might be occurring simultaneously. First, there's an actual coincidence. Two events align. This is real, it happens. The universe is big enough that random alignments occur regularly. Second, there's your brain's pattern recognition system detecting that alignment and flagging it as significant. This is automatic and unconscious. Your brain doesn't ask permission, it just does it. Third, there's the emotional response. Awe, wonder, a sense of rightness. This produces neurochemical states that reinforce the significance. Dopamine might be released, creating a reward signal. This feels amazing. Fourth, there's the narrative construction. You tell yourself a story about why this coincidence happened. Maybe you were meant to meet this person. Maybe the universe was listening to your thoughts. Maybe your intuition guided you. Maybe there really is such a thing as synchronicity. The story feels true because you're constructing it to match your experience. And fifth, there's the memory encoding. You remember this moment vividly, but your memory of the context, all the times you thought about someone and they didn't call, all the times you had a premonition that didn't pan out, that gets faded out and forgotten. So the final result is a strong, vivid, emotionally resonant memory of a meaningful coincidence that feels like proof of synchronicity. And from your subjective perspective, it is proof. You experienced it, it was real. But this is the trap, in a sense. The experience is real, the coincidence is real, the meaning you feel is real. But the inference, that this proves synchronicity exists, that the universe is responsive to consciousness, that these events were connected by more than mere chance, that inference might not be justified. And yet, here's where it gets philosophically complex. Does it matter? Does it matter whether synchronicity is objectively real? If the experience of it genuinely transforms how you live, if it makes you more open, more intuitive, more connected to the world around you, if it gives your life a sense of meaning and purpose. This is the question that separates the scientist from the mystic. The scientist says, if it's not objectively real, it doesn't matter how it feels. We need to understand the truth. The mystic says, if it produces meaningful experience, if it connects you to something larger than yourself, then it's real in the way that matters. And honestly, they're both right. The scientific perspective is right that we shouldn't confuse our experience with reality. We shouldn't make decisions based on false beliefs. We shouldn't build our understanding of the world on illusions. But the mystical perspective is right that meaning is real. That subjective experience matters. That the way we experience the world shapes the world we live in. Here's an example. You could argue that all love is biochemistry, that the feeling you have for another person is just oxytocin and dopamine and neural patterns. And you'd be technically correct. The neurochemistry is real. But does that mean love isn't real? Does that mean the connection you feel to another person is an illusion? Most of us would say no. The neurochemistry doesn't negate the reality of love. It just explains how love manifests in a biological brain. Could synchronicity work the same way? Could the psychological and neurological mechanisms that produce the experience of meaningful coincidence be a real phenomenon? Real enough to shape how we live, to inform our intuitions, to connect us to the world in meaningful ways, even if the ultimate cause is probability rather than cosmic meaning. This is where the argument gets genuinely interesting, because it stops being a simple matter of true versus false and becomes a question about what we mean by real, the disturbing possibility. But let's go darker for a moment. Let's entertain a possibility that most people don't want to seriously consider. What if synchronicity is real, but not in the way Jung thought? What if it's not that your consciousness affects external events? What if it's not that the universe is responsive to your mind? What if it's something far more disturbing? What if reality itself is fundamentally constructed by your perception? This is the territory of some interpretations of quantum mechanics. The idea that the universe doesn't have definite properties until it's observed. That the observer and the observed are not separate. That consciousness and reality are fundamentally intertwined in a way we don't yet understand. If this is true, if reality is observer-dependent in this fundamental way, then synchronicity might be a glimpse of this deeper truth. It might be a moment when you notice that your mind and the external world are not as separate as they seem. That the boundary between inner and outer is more permeable than classical physics suggests. Now, this sounds mystical. It sounds like New Age thinking. But it's actually taken seriously by some quantum physicists and philosophers of physics. The idea that consciousness plays a fundamental role in reality isn't rejected by all scientists. It's just considered fringe. And here's what's disturbing about it. If it's true, it has massive implications. It means that the world you perceive is not independent of you. It means your beliefs, your expectations, your attention literally shape what becomes real. It means you're not a passive observer of an objective universe. You're a co-creator of reality, and this raises profound questions. If reality is partially observer-dependent, then synchronicity isn't a violation of the laws of physics. It's a manifestation of a deeper law, a law that connects mind and matter in ways we're only beginning to understand. But here's the catch. This possibility is almost unprovable. How do you test whether reality is observer-dependent? How do you even distinguish between observer-dependent reality and the kind of reality where consciousness just happens to be really good at pattern finding? You can't. Not easily. Because if reality is observer-dependent, then the same patterns of evidence we observe would be produced regardless. The universe would look the same whether it was truly observer-dependent or whether we were just pattern-finding beings in an objective universe. So we're stuck. We can't prove synchronicity is real in this deeper sense. But we also can't prove it's not. And that uncertainty is where the real mystery lies. And you know what? Maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is the point. Confirmation bias and selective attention. But before we embrace the mystery too deeply, let's talk about something more mundane and more insidious. Confirmation bias. This is one of the most powerful forces in human thinking, and it almost certainly plays a role in how we experience synchronicity. Confirmation bias is the tendency to notice and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while dismissing or forgetting information that contradicts it. It's not intentional. It's automatic. It's built into how human cognition works. Here's a concrete example. You read an article about how your astrological sign tends to be emotional, and you think, yes, that's me. I'm definitely emotional. You remember times you've been emotional. You might even emphasize those memories, make them feel more significant. But you also have times when you're not emotional. Times when you're rational and controlled. But if you already believe you're emotional, those memories get filed differently. They get stored as exceptions, as weird outliers. They don't feel as true as the times you were emotional. So your memory gradually becomes skewed. It starts to feel like you're much more emotional than you actually are, because the emotional incidents stand out and the non-emotional incidents fade into the background. Now apply this to synchronicity. You believe synchronicity exists, so you start noticing synchronicities. You think about your friend, and they text you. That's synchronicity. You see the time 11:11 on the clock. That's synchronicity. You read about a concept in the morning and hear it mentioned on the radio that afternoon. That's synchronicity. But how many times do you think about your friend and they don't text? How many times do you not see 11:11? How many concepts do you read about that never get mentioned again? Those incidents don't register. They're not synchronicities. They're just ordinary life. They fade into background noise. Meanwhile, the synchronicities feel vivid and significant. They stand out. They create emotional resonance. They get remembered. And over time, they accumulate into a strong sense that synchronicity is real, that the universe is meaningful, that there's a hidden order underneath chaos. And the more you believe in synchronicity, the more you notice synchronicities, because your attention is attuned to them. You're actively looking for patterns that confirm your belief. You're not looking for evidence that would disconfirm it. This is why skeptics often point out that people who believe in synchronicity don't seem to notice when synchronicity fails to happen, or when coincidences occur that are meaningless. They filter their experience through the lens of their belief. And the skeptics are probably right about this. Confirmation bias almost certainly plays a huge role in how people come to believe in synchronicity. But here's the complication. Confirmation bias plays a role in everything. It plays a role in how scientists understand data. It plays a role in how doctors diagnose diseases. It plays a role in how all of us perceive reality. In other words, pointing out confirmation bias doesn't prove that synchronicity isn't real. It just points out that we're terrible at objective evaluation. It points out that we see what we expect to see. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? That's what it means to be a conscious being. Consciousness isn't about objective perception. It's about meaningful perception. It's about seeing the world in ways that matter to us. So confirmation bias is a real problem if your goal is objective truth. But it might not be a problem if your goal is meaning. In fact, the ability to see meaningful patterns, even patterns that might not be objectively real, might be central to how humans create lives that feel worth living. The age of digital synchronicity. We live in an age of unprecedented connection, and it's created something that might be called digital synchronicity. Think about it. You're scrolling through social media, and you see a post from someone you were just thinking about. You search for a concept on Google, and the first link is exactly what you need. You follow a recommendation on Spotify, and the next song is perfectly suited to your mood. You get an ad for a product right after thinking about that product. These are all synchronicities in a sense. They're meaningful coincidences. Your internal state aligns with external information. You think of something and that thing appears. But here's what's different. Most of these aren't actually coincidences. They're algorithmic. They're designed. The platforms we use, Google, Facebook, Amazon, YouTube, Spotify, they all use recommendation algorithms. These algorithms are designed to predict what you want based on your past behavior, your stated interests, and the behavior of people similar to you. They're trying to create the experience of synchronicity. They're trying to make what you want appear to align with what you're offered. And they're remarkably effective at it. Which means we now live in an environment where meaningful coincidence is engineered, where synchronicity is manufactured. This has profound implications. On one hand, it suggests that our sense of synchronicity might be even more easily manipulated than we thought. That we can be led to feel that the universe is responding to us when actually it's just algorithms tuned to predict our behavior. On the other hand, it suggests something else. It suggests that the line between coincidence and causation is blurrier than we thought. Because when an algorithm predicts what you want, is that causation? You didn't cause the algorithm to recommend something, but the algorithm did cause the recommendation based on its prediction of your desires. So is there a causal chain? Is there causation without physical mechanism? This gets at a deeper question. What is causation really? In the classical view, a causes be through some physical mechanism. You press the button, the light turns on. You push the ball, it rolls. Cause and effect are connected through physical interaction. But in the modern digital world, causation is more abstract. An algorithm causes a recommendation because it was designed to predict your preferences. But there's no physical mechanism connecting your mind to the algorithm's output. There's just information, pattern matching, prediction. And in a sense, this is what Jung was describing with synchronicity. Not physical causation, not a pushing bee, but meaningful connection, pattern alignment. The correspondence between inner and outer that doesn't require a physical mechanism. So maybe synchronicity in the digital age becomes more rather than less plausible. Because we're living in a world where meaningful alignments are actually being engineered. We're living in a world where the boundary between randomness and pattern is being deliberately blurred. And if synchronicity can be engineered by algorithms, then why couldn't it emerge naturally from the structure of reality itself? Why couldn't consciousness have the same kind of predictive power that algorithms have? Why couldn't mind be tuned to reality in ways that create meaningful alignments? Again, this is speculative, but it's interesting speculation because it suggests that synchronicity might not be magical thinking. It might just be recognition that reality, including human consciousness, operates according to patterns that are deeper and more connected than our ordinary understanding suggests. Ancient wisdom and modern misunderstanding. For most of human history, synchronicity wasn't considered strange at all. In Eastern philosophy, particularly in traditions like Taoism and Buddhism, the idea that consciousness and the external world are fundamentally interconnected wasn't weird. It was obvious. It was the basic starting point. In Taoism, there's a concept called Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. The idea is that when you're in alignment with the Tao, when you're moving with the grain of reality rather than against it, things unfold naturally. Your intentions align with what's actually needed. Coincidences happen that seem to move you forward. Doors open. This isn't magic. It's not even supernatural. It's just what happens when you're in harmony with how things are. When you're not forcing, when you're attuned, when you're paying attention. Similarly, in Buddhism, there's the concept of interdependence. The idea that all things are connected, that there's no such thing as truly isolated causes, that everything is the result of a web of causes and conditions so intricate that we can't fully trace them. And therefore, apparent coincidences are just moments when we notice the connections that are always there. In indigenous cultures around the world, this understanding is even more embedded. The idea that humans and nature are not separate, that we're part of an interconnected web, that to pay attention to the world is to be affected by it, and to affect it in return. These aren't primitive superstitions. They're sophisticated understandings of how consciousness and reality relate, and they offer a framework in which synchronicity makes sense without requiring magical explanations. The problem is that the modern Western worldview explicitly rejects this framework. We've been taught that mind and matter are separate, that consciousness is private and internal, that the external world is objective and independent of our observation, that the universe is fundamentally random and meaningless, and we project meaning onto it rather than discovering meaning that's already there. This worldview is powerful. It's produced modern science and technology. It's done remarkable things. But it might also be fundamentally incomplete. It might be missing something essential about how reality works. And here's the thing, Jung wasn't rejecting modern science. He was trying to expand it. He was trying to create a framework that could accommodate both the achievements of scientific materialism and the undeniable phenomena that materialism struggled to explain. Synchronicity, in this sense, is a bridge. It's a way of thinking about how consciousness and reality might be connected that doesn't require us to abandon reason or empiricism. It's a framework that takes seriously both the patterns that Jung observed and the patterns that Taoist philosophers and indigenous mystics have observed for thousands of years. Whether synchronicity is really real, in an objective sense, might matter less than the fact that it's real in a functional sense. It shapes how we relate to the world. It shapes how we experience meaning. And it connects us to a long human tradition of seeing the world as inherently meaningful rather than inherently random. Living with mystery. Here's what we've arrived at: we don't know. We've explored the evidence from multiple angles. We've looked at neuroscience, at psychology, at probability theory, at quantum mechanics, at philosophy, at culture. And what we've found is that the truth is genuinely indeterminate. It's not that we're missing evidence. It's that the evidence itself is ambiguous. Synchronicity could be explained as pattern finding in randomness. Or it could be a genuine phenomenon that science hasn't yet figured out how to measure. Or it could be something in between. A real psychological phenomenon that produces meaningful experience, even if it's not cosmically true. And the honest answer is, we might never know for sure. This bothers people. We want certainty. We want to know the truth. We want to be able to point to evidence and say, this is what's really happening. But maybe certainty is not available on this question. Maybe some mysteries are resistant to solution. Maybe the question of whether synchronicity is real is one of those questions that we can't answer through observation or experiment. Maybe it's a question that each person has to answer for themselves based on their own experience. So let me ask you a different question. Does it matter? If synchronicity is real in the sense that meaningful coincidences happen regularly, and they matter to you, and they change how you live, does it matter whether the ultimate cause is cosmic or psychological? If paying attention to synchronicity makes you more aware, more intuitive, more connected to the world around you, is that a problem? If believing in synchronicity leads you to make better choices, to trust your instincts, to move through the world with more openness and less fear, what's the harm in that? On the other hand, if believing in synchronicity leads you to make decisions based on magical thinking, if it leads you to ignore evidence and reason, if it leads you to shirk responsibility by blaming coincidence instead of taking action, then yes, that's a problem. The question, as always, is how to hold both truths. How to be open to mystery and meaning while also maintaining skepticism and reason. How to believe in synchronicity without being naive about it. How to distrust coincidence without dismissing the real patterns in your life. And here's what I think is the deepest insight. The question of whether synchronicity is real might be less important than the question of how you relate to randomness. Because here's what's true. The universe is absurdly large. The number of potential coincidences that could happen is astronomical. And therefore, by probability alone, remarkable coincidences will happen. Regularly, to everyone. The question is not whether coincidences happen. They do. The question is how you interpret them. Do you dismiss them as meaningless? Or do you see them as opportunities to connect more deeply with your life? This is not about denying reality or embracing delusion. It's about choosing where to put your attention. It's about deciding what matters. Because your attention shapes your reality. Not in a magical sense, but in a practical sense. What you pay attention to becomes more salient. What becomes salient shapes your choices. Your choices shape your life. So if you pay attention to synchronicity, if you notice the moments when your inner world aligns with external events, if you look for meaning in coincidence, then your life will feel more meaningful. Not because the coincidences are more cosmic, but because you're relating to your life with more attention and intention. And maybe that's what Jung really discovered. Not that the universe is cosmically responsive to consciousness, but that consciousness, when attentive, when open, when attuned, can find meaning and connection in the fabric of ordinary life. That synchronicity is a practice of attention, a way of waking up to the subtle patterns that are always present. In other words, synchronicity might not be something that the universe does to you. It might be something that you do, something you practice, a way of living that creates the experience of meaningful connection, regardless of whether that connection has some ultimate metaphysical reality. And if that's true, then the question of whether synchronicity is really real becomes almost philosophical, because the practice itself, the attention, the openness, the search for meaning, that's real. And the transformation it produces in how you live, that's real. And perhaps that's enough. So here we are at the edge of night, having explored the mystery of synchronicity from every angle we could find. We've gone through the science and the psychology. We've sat with Jung and the quantum physicists. We've examined our own pattern-finding brains and how easily they deceive us. We've looked at probability and confirmation bias and the algorithms that now shape our reality. And the truth is, we haven't solved the mystery. If anything, we've made it deeper. We've shown that there are legitimate arguments on multiple sides, that reasonable people can disagree, that consciousness and reality might be connected in ways we don't yet understand. But here's what I want you to know, that uncertainty is not a failure, that mystery is not a problem to be solved, that the fact we don't have a complete answer to the question, why does synchronicity feel so real, is not something to be frustrated by. It's something to sit with, something to wonder about, something to let shape how you move through the world. Because maybe that's what synchronicity really is. Not a cosmic principle, not a glitch in human perception, but an invitation to pay more attention, to be more aware, to look for the connections that are always present, to trust your instincts while also maintaining your skepticism, to believe in meaning while acknowledging mystery. As you drift towards sleep now, I want you to think about the synchronicities in your own life. The times when you thought of someone and they contacted you. The moments when you needed something and it appeared. The coincidences that shaped your path forward. Don't worry about whether they're really real in some cosmic sense. Just notice them. Feel the meaning in them. Let them remind you that you're not isolated, that you're connected to something larger, that the world is responsive to your attention. And when you wake tomorrow, try this. Pay attention to the small coincidences. Notice the moments when your inner state aligns with external events. See if you can find synchronicity, not to prove it's real, but to practice a way of being in the world that's more awake, more attuned, more connected. Because whether synchronicity is a cosmic truth or a psychological practice, the result is the same: a life that feels more meaningful, a world that seems more responsive, a sense of connection to something larger than yourself. And in the end, maybe that's what matters most. Sleep well, and keep your eyes open for the synchronicities that are waiting to find you. They're out there, in the coincidences, in the chance encounters, in the moments when the inner and outer align, in the mysterious way that life organizes itself around meaning. The mystery remains, and perhaps it always will. And that's exactly as it should be. Sweet dreams.